My name is Prem. I'm the Senior Marketing Specialist at CreoSpark. I wanted to welcome you all to our webinar on Microsoft 365 Beyond Email and Teams, Enabling Business Value. We're not just talking about emails and Teams. We're diving into the full ecosystem of Microsoft 365. Think automation, collaboration, AI-powered productivity, and business transformation. So let's get started. I wanted to take a moment to introduce your host for today, CreoSpark. We are a team of Canada and US-based Microsoft 365 implementation experts, passionate about helping our clients achieve their ideal employee experience. We create and support great employee experience with Microsoft 365 Digital Workspace. Our headquarters are based in Davis, California, and Toronto, Canada. We have three main solution areas. Modern work. The purpose is to make sure organization can work from anywhere on any devices exactly the way you want. Process transformation is to help organization of any sizes to go digital at their own pace, transferring some repetitive tasks to AI. On secure cloud, making sure your security, compliance, identity, and device management are solid because the cloud should be as safe as it is smart. Our focus is on leveraging Microsoft technologies, including Microsoft 365, Power Platform, and Azure for delivering this for our clients. Okay, so for housekeeping, feel free to add your questions to the chat during the webinar. Handouts and certificates of the attendance will be sent out to your email after today's webinar session. You'll also receive recording and recap blog next week too. All right, I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today, Colin. Colin leads our secure cloud and modern work practice here at CreoSpark. He's also a Microsoft MVP alumni, which basically means he has been recognized for doing some pretty amazing things in Microsoft space. He has helped countless teams make sense of complex tech and turn it into real world impact. And honestly, there's no better person to guide us through what's next. Colin, I'll let you share more about your journey and what's on your mind today. Floor is yours.
Thanks, Prem. I'm just going to share my screen really quick and go over the agenda.
Sweet.
Let me know once it's transferred over, and we'll take it from there. All right. Have I got the screen now? All right, super. So I'm going to go through this in what I believe to be a logical fashion, right? We'll talk about why now, right? Why are we talking about this now? So I thought M365 migrations were behind us. I'm going to talk a little bit about SharePoint and some history there, and some of the different versions. Talk about a digital modernization journey, or how we see the journey with our clients, and maybe share some of those learnings with you. Talking about roadmaps for migrations, some of the risks, and I'll bring in a colleague to help discuss some of that, and how we can manage some of those risks. Communicating with your stakeholders, and then some key takeaways. Any questions before we get started? You can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, or however you want to do. No, I think Prem's going to run a poll. Prem, let me know when we're done with the poll.
Yep, the poll is active right now.
Okay. Can we let the poll run while I continue?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So in order to sound smart, we like to use quotes from famous people. This is from George Westerman. He was at MIT. It talks about transformative potential of digital initiatives. And that's really what we're talking about, is migrations that add new value and transform businesses, right? And he talks about the caterpillar, and the way we think about it is the caterpillar is limited its capabilities, but once it transforms into a butterfly, it's able to do some new amazing things. And wanted to use that as an analogy for what we can do with Microsoft 365, even though you're already using it, and but in many ways we're still all caterpillars. And for migration, the word migration comes from nature, right? We're talking about butterflies. Monarch butterflies migrate from the northern parts of North America and Canada and Alaska all the way down to Mexico, right? And that migration is not without risk. And we'll look to nature, because that's where the concept of migration comes from, for some of our lessons. So who is this webinar for, right? It's for business and IT leaders, organizations already using M365, but you know what? I would argue that a lot of the value here applies to any migration, not just M365. We're M365 experts. That's my world. That's what I do day to day. So a lot of my examples are going to be around M365. But a lot of these learnings can apply to any type of migration, even outside of IT, right? But really, my examples are going to be for people that are planning digital transformations involving M365. Okay. But why now? Why are we talking about this today? Well, I like to look to history to help inform the present and predict the future. So I thought I'd look at a couple of key milestones that brought us to where we are, right? And SharePoint really is the plumbing behind M365, right? That's without SharePoint, a lot of the really interesting functionality around collaboration and version control and is not possible, right? So SharePoint's really been around since early this century. I remember I was working at Microsoft when they were working on Project Tahoe, that it became SharePoint. And in the early part of this century, that was typically run on premise, and I'll talk more about that. We look also at 2011 to 2015 when SharePoint Online first became available and Link Online became available, which later became Skype for Business. And there were early adopters of M365 around the same time. It started off as BPOS, and before that there was service provider licensing for email. But really around that 2011 to 2015 timeframe was when what we call today M365 or Microsoft 365 started to really form and be available as Office 365. But most organizations that were adopting at the time, they were early adopters, but they were focusing really on email and licensing costs around the productivity suite. Those were the big drivers then, right? Then in 2017, Teams was released, and Skype for Business started to go away. And there were still some early adopters there. Teams was not still fully formed the way it is today, the way we're using it for a webinar. Those functionalities didn't exist. And then something happened in 2020. We're not going to talk about that, but there was a rapid growth of Teams. The world changed. We had 10 years worth of digital transformation in a very, very short period of time. And here we are today. A lot of organizations went through that rapid adoption of Teams and M365 without doing proper planning and risk management and security management, because they had to change how people worked very rapidly. So here we are today. We have an opportunity to look at some modernization and cost savings. So that's really why I think it's really important to look at this now. If you look at Microsoft 365, and depending on what version you have, you've got 40 to 50 different tools in the suite. And most organizations, if they're lucky, will use 10 of those. All right. Remember I said that SharePoint was the plumbing in M365? Well, one of the interesting things about cloud platforms, especially SaaS platforms, right? And SaaS is software as a service, just as a reminder. It really made enterprise class computing services available to smaller organizations. They didn't have to have large data centers. When I started my career, I worked in a data center. It was size of a football field with lots and lots of equipment. Small organizations can't afford that and weren't able to manage that. But now they've got access to things like that. So whether it was Citrix farms or whether it was supercomputers, those are types of things that small organizations just couldn't do on their own. And SharePoint is very similar, right? When we talk about SharePoint on my next slide, you'll see what I mean. And today, every M365 customer has access to SharePoint. They have access to Power Platform. They have access to Viva, Copilot, and even Fabric. So what does that mean? If they're not taking advantage of it, there's a lost opportunity. And why aren't they taking advantage of it? In many cases, it's because they've got to migrate some existing systems to be able to take advantage of it. One of the things we see, especially in small organizations, is that they really don't have an IM team or IM expertise at all. And so using SharePoint becomes almost like a cargo cult with a Tesla. I'm not trying to make fun of Tesla, but enough other people doing that today. But I look at it as if you gave a Tesla to a cargo cult and they start pulling it around with a goat because they don't understand the power of it and what it takes to use it properly. And that's really what information management and governance allow you to do with SharePoint. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. So, okay, here's a plug. We are a consulting company, so our IM expertise is available to you if you should need it. So a little bit of a plug, but I'm hoping that most of this information is something that you can take and apply to your organization today. All right, so I mentioned SharePoint on-prem or on-premise, and a lot of the Fortune 500 or large enterprise class organizations that used it, they had to have a SharePoint farm, multiple servers, and they had to manage that. And they typically had a dedicated team to manage that. They had information management and governance in place. So what's the differences? Let's look at the major differences. Is that SharePoint on-prem is complex. SharePoint Online, which you get in M365, is not nearly as complex. You can just use it out of the box. You can use it as a big file server if you really wanted to. It's a lost opportunity, but it's possible, right? With SharePoint Online, you don't have to invest in infrastructure, hardware and software, and you don't have to maintain it, right? Microsoft does that for you. The deployment cycle is very, very short, near zero, right? Now, you do get more control when you have it on premise, but with less control, you get more standardization and more stability. Customization is similar. Much more scalability. It's in theory, it's infinitely elastic, and you could have a better user experience when it comes to remote collaboration. I collaborate with people around the world, and if I was hosting this myself in my own data center, that could be a lot more complex from a networking perspective and local caching and all of that. Microsoft has that CDN, content delivery network, built out around the world, so I can collaborate with people. And also, when we talk about compliance, Microsoft has, FedRAMP and DoD standards and all SOC 2 and all of the other compliance standards built into the platform that you can take advantage of that you would normally have to do yourself if you were managing that on-prem. And then we talk about cost. This is really what's made it accessible, right? You'd have both capital expenses as well as operating expense if you were doing it yourself. But today, for as little as $15 a month, I have access to SharePoint. So it's very, very accessible. But that's why I think we're at a really interesting time. Organizations that have moved to Microsoft 365 for email and Teams have a lot of other opportunities that are going untapped, and they'd be able to take advantage of that and grow their business. So why migrate? There's really three reasons why organizations migrate. They have a burning platform. what a burning platform is something that they have to get off of for whatever reasons. Maybe it's end of life, doesn't meet regulatory compliance, etc. So some of the ones we work with regularly are things like Lotus Notes, Valo intranet sites, Bonsai intranet sites, as well as many others that we help organizations migrate to SharePoint Online. Another reason organizations migrate is to modernize. They want new business capabilities, or they want to future-proof something, or meet new compliance standards, as I said. And really simple examples of modernization, just so you get a feel for it, is file shares moving to OneDrive or SharePoint, or SharePoint on-premise to SharePoint Online, right? We'll talk more about that because that's also what we call a rationalization opportunity, right? When I say rationalization, that's really where cost savings come in. I've got multiple tools doing the same thing, and I've paid for Microsoft 365, and I've got tools in there. So maybe I'm using SurveyMonkey today. Well, I've got Microsoft Forms, and I'm already paying for that. So maybe I can save a little bit of money and stop paying for SurveyMonkey. Or I've got Calendly, and I want to switch to bookings. And then in some large organizations, things like GC Docs in the federal government, or OpenText, or Box or Dropbox, some of those types of services, you're paying for those, and maybe you don't need to pay for them. So it's a cost savings opportunity. And also vendor consolidation, so you have less vendors to deal with. Okay, now we're going to get into some more interesting facets of modernization. So this is in the CreoSpark world. We have a methodology that we call Spark, and we look at digital modernizations as a journey, and we break it up into phases. And what I'm going to focus on is, really the business outcomes that organizations want, because nobody migrates just for the sake of migrating. I talked to you about the three big drivers, but there's something in it for the business. Nobody decides to spend $100,000 or $50,000 or $200,000 on a migration just because, right? It's not a big flex. So we break it down into a visioning stage, a readiness stage, a migration stage, and then once the migration is complete, you actually get the new technical capabilities. And what do we mean by that? So some of the things we're talking about, since our examples are Microsoft 365, things like Copilot. A colleague of mine, Nuno Joachim, did a presentation yesterday on Copilot and how important the data readiness is for that. So we might have to do a data migration in order to make best use of Copilot, or maybe you want to use Power Platform, or you're building a new intranet. I mentioned some of those, or you want to use Viva, and there's some migrations that need to happen to be able to position your organization to take advantage of that and get the business outcomes they want. So I'm going to come back to this slide. I just wanted to show you how we see these types of initiatives. But one of the things you notice here I want to focus on is that roadmap. One of the things we do in that vision stage is create a roadmap and explain to you why that's important. So why create a roadmap? There's 6 main reasons. And one is clear direction. Understand your migration, and create that plan. Understand what it's going to take. So I really like breaking out that road mapping, essentially that whole vision phase as its own project, because you have a lot of insights, and I'll talk to you about those, that can really inform the plan, the budget, the timeline for the migration. And you'll get much, much more accurate and precise estimates for how long things are going to take, how much it's going to cost, and the skills you need. And then you can create a much better plan for the migration. So I really like doing this mini project first. Okay, so we talked about clear direction, resource allocation, right? You need to have the right people available and have them available at the right time, and understand what that means. Sometimes you don't have the right skill sets and you need to look at a partner for that, or you want to grow that in-house. But if you don't know the skills you need, there's a very, very good potential you won't have them available, and your migration will run into trouble. Stakeholder engagement, right? Remember, it's all about business. The migration is there to enable some new business outcome, and you need to get your stakeholders engaged and on side. We'll talk a little bit later about change and adoption management, but I've been involved in projects that go very, very well. They're very successful from a technical perspective. We get a new SharePoint site deployed, or some other service is put in place, and nobody uses it. So you really need to make sure that the stakeholders engaged and that the user community is engaged early, and they understand what's happening, and we get their input so that you can get the most value out of your initiative. Data integrity, right? We want to make sure that you migrate what you need and keep it intact, but also maybe minimize what you don't need to migrate. And for a lot of organizations, they've got data curation requirements, and whether it's legal or compliance requirements to keep data for a certain length of time, and have the lineage and chain of custody for legal requirements. Budget, that's the big one, right? Everybody wants more for less. And so by creating that roadmap, we can really figure out what we need to do, and we can adjust our timelines and our budget appropriately, and have much more cost certainty, right? So I got at the bottom of this slide, I've got a lot of numbers there. These are estimates that we've come up with after doing dozens and dozens of these, how much we believe can be saved, both from a budget perspective or from an adoption perspective. And the last one is risk management. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it right now, because we're going to go into that a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But that's why we believe strongly in the value of a roadmap. And I really recommend that you create one yourself for your projects. Next is the keys to a successful migration. So we found that there's really 4 drivers to project success, right? And really getting a handle on these early as part of that roadmap and throughout the migration is what's going to help drive the successful project. So volumetrics, right? And ease of mapping data in new environments. So that's all about your data complexity. So understanding your data, understanding how much of it you have, and is it going to actually work the way you expect it to? So if you're going from open text to SharePoint, there isn't necessarily a one-to-one mapping of those data objects. So you've got to have to do some work to figure out what you're going to lose, and whether it's important, and how you want to manage that, and what you're going to gain and how you're going to harness that. Most projects are about 3 things, right? Success is measured in, are you on time? Are you on budget? And and as the quality there. So let's talk about schedule. There's a lot of dependencies and level of effort estimates that go into being on schedule, and creating that roadmap is one of the pieces around that, but also making sure the next one is the skill set, right? So you have to understand the dependencies, and I'll go back to that migration journey, the data transformation journey, and talk to you about some of those dependencies a little later. But skill set and availability of key resources. There's 2 pieces here. One, do you have the right skills? Do you even know what they are, and how do you identify those? But more importantly, once you've identified them, are they available? And do you have a plan B? How do we de-risk that? Right? We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And then we talk about the overall risk of the project and the risk to the business, right? So if you're migrating an order inventory system, and you're an e-commerce organization, something goes wrong, that could really affect your business. And so people are going to be nervous. You better get it right. Even the downtime required to do the migration is something they want to avoid. So everything you can do to mitigate that and manage that risk is really important in the business, right? I'm gonna move on if there's no other questions. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce one of my colleagues, Wyatt Shu. Worked with me. He works with me, and he's involved in some of our migrations. But he's early in his IT career. So while he knows that certain things are important, he's curious. We've had a lot of discussions around this as to why certain things are important and how you can make best use of knowledge from past migrations to de-risk some of the future endeavors. So I'm going to introduce Wyatt, and we're going to go to the next slide. Wyatt, is your mic on?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks, Colin.
Okay.
Let's jump right in.
All right. So you've got some questions.
Yeah. All right. Starting off, why is risk management so important to a migration?
Right. So I started by talking about that a little bit. That first off, we're talking about business risk. Right? If you can't manage business risk, you may not be in business much longer. And we see that all the time with businesses failing. So IT is becoming more and more important. So we really need to be aware of that. But risk management itself is the action of anticipating and having a plan available for issues, right? So there's things that are going to be unforeseen or overlooked during the migration process. So what we need to do is try to anticipate what could go wrong. Can't spend forever on it, but what are the most likely things that could go wrong, and do we have a plan to manage that? So when we talk about risk management, remember I said we're going to talk about nature a little bit. When you think of migration, is there a specific animal you think of?
Not really.
I think of birds, right? As a child, it's one of the first things you see is in the spring and fall. Living in Canada, we see birds migrating. That most of the birds in North America migrate at night. And why do they do that? It's a risk management exercise, right? It's because can't be seen by hunters or other predators, right? And so they're doing risk management. So are we, and that's interestingly enough, in IT, we end up doing a lot of our migrations at night too.
Wonderful.
All right. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. Let's keep moving. So what happens if a migration is undertaken with poor planning and strategy, and how can this be avoided?
Well, one of the things I said is you want to get your estimates as tight as possible, and you want to get your plan as tight as possible. Because if you don't, you're going to miss deadlines, so your timeline's going to be off. You're probably going to end up spending more than you expected because there'll be lots of unforeseen costs that you have to deal with. Your staff aren't going to be happy; they're going to be overwhelmed. Your user community is not going to enjoy the process, right? So you need to have clear goals, right? Understand the timelines. Is your business seasonal, and when the best time to do the migration is, so you can minimize that impact. Again, I talked about roadmaps. I'm going to come back to that again. And really, don't underestimate the skill sets required in making sure you have the right resources available, whether that's in-house or outsourced. And be very realistic about the downtime that you're going to have to manage and any blockers to that process. All right, anything else?
Yeah, let's I got a bunch more actually. So how does improper resource allocation affect a migration, and what sort of steps can be done to mitigate this?
So training is a big piece. You want to make sure that we have people with the right skills, right? Typically, your staff is one of your biggest bottlenecks. You can always, when you're doing a migration, a lot of it is automated, I would hope, right? We can write a script to migrate something, or we can use a migration tool. We've all heard of BitTitans or ShareGates and all kinds of migration tools. Oftentimes, you set it, you let it go, and you can migrate in parallel. You're still using your live system, but you're migrating data to the new system in parallel or in the background. So that's not going to affect your timeline as much, or not necessarily. But so people only work a certain number of hours a day. They get sick. they go on vacation, and you need to have a plan to deal with that and make sure that you don't have people on 3 projects if they're critical to your project. Make sure that you understand when their vacations are. Build in buffer should somebody get ill and have to take some time off, so that good project management is really important, and good estimation for the project. And that way you've got a little bit of wiggle room should something go wrong.
Great. All right, let's move on to more of a security-oriented question.
Okay.
So migrations do pose serious security threats. What can
Right.
be done to sort of lock down your environment so that these environment vulnerabilities can be prevented?
Okay, so I like to think, I don't like to think of migration as a separate case for security, but I'll tell you what I've seen happen. So first off, think of your migration as a production environment, even though it's not operational yet. While you're in flight doing your migration. So I've seen people do things for expediency because it makes the migration faster or simpler. That they'll use like global admin accounts, or they won't fully lock down an environment, or they won't put the permissions model on yet. They'll just try to get everything moved over as quickly as possible and then add that later. Sometimes adding it later causes unforeseen issues, or not all of the controls are in place the way they should be. And I'd like to think of using your migration environment as a production environment from day one. It's a great opportunity to test out some of your access controls and other security procedures, and you don't have to worry about it being forgotten after as you productionalize. So also take so in your normal production environment, you'll have multi-layered security. You'll conduct regular audits. If possible, use a sandbox to test out things. So don't test things in production if you can avoid it. Sometimes that's difficult in cloud environments. Other times it's much easier depending on the licensing you have available to you.
All right. Let's keep moving forward. What else do we have? So yeah, in terms of governance, how can we best work around downtimes what are proper governance frameworks and how are they important to a migration?
So governance is a word that's often misunderstood, but governance is how we do things and how we make sure that they're done properly, right? It talks about roles and responsibilities. It talks about compliance. It might have things as simple as naming conventions and ConOps, who does what when. So it's important to have these things in place because it helps you make better decisions, especially in a compliance perspective. But what I often see happening is people say governance is important, and they implement governance as part of the migration. What I prefer is that governance is in place before the migration and people are comfortable with it, so that they can actually see where things are going off the rails from a governance and compliance perspective during the migration and course correct. So you're not learning the governance framework at the same time as the migration.
Yeah, I think that's important. You might be getting like a double migration if the governance is not in place before.
Yeah, and also making your change management much more difficult.
Yeah. Okay. Why is continuous monitoring critical during migration, and how can it be properly implemented?
So continuous monitoring is important all the time. Again, it's important in a production environment. It's important from a security perspective. And I've seen a lot of organizations add the monitoring after. Well, it's a lost opportunity because the monitoring it takes time to fine tune and get some of the thresholds right, et cetera, et cetera. So if you do it during the migration, you get the benefit of being able to have better, more precise monitoring. But even more importantly, issues during the migration can be uncovered that you may not have uncovered if you weren't monitoring. So then you can correct before going live, right? And adjust your migration strategy if you've missed something, right? So again, the monitoring is part of the governance framework too. And again, it should not be new. It should be something that the team is already familiar with.
Yeah, for sure. All right. And then in terms of some general migration questions, like how could we best work around downtime during migration?
Yeah, it's very rare to have a migration without downtime. You could build out the new environment in parallel and then just have a cutover date where everybody stops using the old system, starts using a new system. But even that cutover creates a little bit of a disruption, so you can call that downtime. In other cases, you have to use live data or journal data. But what I like to plan for is benchmarks, right? Understand the maintenance window you have available to you, especially if it's a production system and it's a 24/7 business. There is you've got a limited maintenance window. So what I like to do is benchmark key elements of the migration, so I know how long they're going to take. Do it with test data if I have to, or do it in a lab environment, and get really good estimates of how long something's going to take, that benchmark. I also like to have a rollback plan so that if something goes wrong, I can go back, I can revert back to a previous state that's still functional, so that at the end of the maintenance window, people can continue to do what they need to do. And I need to have a trigger, meaning, here's an example. If I have an 8-hour maintenance window and my benchmark tells me my migration should take 6 hours and my rollback takes 3 hours, right? I need to, somewhere between hour 4 and hour 5 of that migration process, I need to figure out if I need to stop the migration and roll back, or else I will run up against the end of my maintenance window and not have it rolled back yet. So knowing that and planning for that's important, especially in an organization where it's difficult to get downtime.
All right. And I guess one last question. How can resistance to change from employees be reduced during migration? Because it seems like that's an inevitable issue.
Yeah, so it's funny, especially in IT where everything's constantly changing. What we see is the only thing people hate more than the way things are is change, right? So we really need to focus on good change and adoption management. And that means transparency between all levels of management and the user community. They need to understand why we're doing this, that there's a business reason for it that will have better business outcomes, potentially making their jobs easier as well. But there's going to be some adaptation required, right? So we're going to have to make sure that they get new training. The training is timely, so don't give them the training now and migrate 6 months from now. We need to have good open communication, and I like to have Tiger teams available to help them right after the migration should something just not work as they expect, or should they need refreshers on training, so that the transition can be as smooth as possible.
Great. Yeah, that's all the questions I had today. Thanks, Colin. Super informative.
Super. Thank you. I'm going to move on to one of my last slides before I wrap it up, and that's communication with stakeholders, especially during the roadmap process. You're going to be talking to different stakeholders, and throughout the project you are as well. And if you want to keep them engaged, and if you want to make sure that they're your champions, you need to speak to them in their own language. So it's about calibrating the message, right? So here's a few of them. So and the things they care about. The owner or the CEO, he's responsible for the strategy of the business and growing it. So we need to position the migration as a growth opportunity and why that's important to growth. I'm not going to read through these for you, but this is kind of my cheat sheet. Depending on who I'm talking to, these are examples of how I might deliver the exact same message using different language and focusing on different benefits. Because when I'm talking to, let's say, an HR manager, he or she may not really be interested in creating efficiency. They may, but they may not, because it's not necessarily their responsibility. When I'm talking to someone in information management, I'm going to make sure I focus on data quality, security, and governance, and not necessarily on new business capabilities. When I'm talking to the IT director, I'm going to talk about how it's going to be more manageable and less risky because you're not on an out-of-date system. So it's important to calibrate that message, and that's how you build goodwill and engagement throughout the organization. All right. One of my slides is gone, or is it? No, it's on the next one. So key takeaways, right? Project success is really influenced by in our experience, 4 things: data complexity, schedule, resourcing, and risk management. Spent a lot of time talking about risk management. We can talk about some of the other things if you need to. Key takeaway here, though, is break your migration project into sub-projects. I'm going to show you that again on the next slide. Really important if you want to have more precise estimates is to decouple that readiness and roadmap from the major migration initiative and take a look at the other remediations you need to do. And then calibrate your message for different stakeholders to increase buy-in. Let's, before we wrap up, take a look at this slide again. So when I'm talking about sub-projects, right, we talked about governance, we talked maybe about IAM strategy, tooling, there might be some remediation. You're not going to know this until you've done your assessment and built that roadmap and understand all of these sub-projects before you get to the actual meat of the actual migration, because you're not migrating just because you want to migrate. In some cases you are just moving data from one place to the other, but those are often more simple migrations. It's the ones where we're talking about new technical capabilities that drive new business capabilities, right? We really want to create that roadmap and those sub-projects. All right. Any questions?
Colin, we do have some questions on the Q&A panel.
Okay. Let me switch over to that. Shall I end the slideshow and you'll take over the slides, or?
Yes, I'll do that.
Or do you want to read the questions?
Yeah, for sure. I'll read it out. Okay, this is the question from Ricardo. What about the issue related to the data classification and the best way to work in the new environment?
That's a great question. We do a lot of work around data mapping and data classification. So there are tools for that. Remember we talked about, let me go back a slide. Hang on. So we talked about tooling, and we talked about remediation and IAM strategy very quickly. So there are tools for that. So there are tools to help you do the data classification if you don't already have it. Things like SharePoint Premium have some interesting tools to help you classify data. Purview have some, so that becomes a sub-project potentially, right? That you can use as part of your readiness to get that data classified properly. Did that answer your question? I'll take that as a yes. All right. I mean, Prim, is there another question?
That's one that popped up by.
While you're asking questions, I'll put that up so people can scan that and win a gift card.
Oh, okay. Perfect. I think. All right. Awesome. Thank you, Colin and we. So your feedback is valuable to us as it helps us improve our webinar and create quality content for you all. To access the survey, simply scan the QR code on the screen. Your participation will be directly contributed to the quality of our webinar, and you also have a chance to win $50 Amazon gift card.
Okay. Shall I leave that up, or shall I move on to the other slides?
Yeah, let's move on.
Okay. So.
Awesome.
Do we want to show the slide? Are we good? We're done. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you attending, and hope you learned something. As I said, this applies to pretty much any migration. Just my examples happen to be M365 focused.
Thank you all. Thank you for attending our webinar today. Thank you.